The sound that shouldn't have happened. Paramount Studios, Spring 1963. The afternoon light filtered through the high windows of Stage 12 in thin, golden shafts, cutting through suspended dust like beams in a cathedral. Film sets are strange places. Controlled chaos wrapped in illusion. Walls that are only half walls. Living rooms that end in darkness. Childhood bedrooms built from plywood and paint. Dean Martin sat in a folding canvas chair just outside his own soundstage, flipping casually through a revised script. He had mastered the art of composure in Hollywood. Problems rolled off him. Directors argued. Producers panicked. Dean showed up, delivered, and left. That was the arrangement. The industry liked men who didn't complicate things. Then he heard it. Not loud at first, not dramatic. A sharp crack. Or the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a rehearsal space. He froze mid-sip of coffee. For half a second, his brain tried to reframe it. A dropped prop. A snapped piece of wood. A chair leg breaking. Then came the crying. High. Stunned. Not theatrical. Real. The kind of crying that bypasses pride and goes straight to survival. Dean stood slowly. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. The crying was coming from the neighboring soundstage, where a period family drama was shooting under the direction of a respected but notoriously volatile filmmaker named Arthur Vale. A man praised for extracting raw performances from actors. A man whispered about in private but defended in public because his films made money. Dean didn't rush. He walked, each step deliberate. He pushed open the heavy soundstage door. Inside, the artificial living room set glowed beneath hanging lights. Floral wallpaper, a sofa positioned for camera angles, a toy train on the floor. Crew members stood frozen. Actors avoided eye contact. In the center of the set stood Arthur Vale, and in front of him, a boy no older than 8. The boy's small frame trembled violently. His cheek was red. His lower lip split slightly. His hands shook as he tried to stop crying and couldn't. Vale's hand was still half raised. "I told you," the director snapped. "You crossed to the window on father, not after. How hard is that? You're ruining the timing." The boy tried to speak, but could only gasp through tears. Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He simply said, "That's enough." It wasn't loud, but it carried. Vale turned sharply, irritation morphing into recognition when he saw who stood behind him. "Well," Vale said coolly, adjusting his jacket, "if it isn't Mr. Martin, this is a closed set." "I heard something open," Dean replied calmly. "Sounded like a hand." A murmur moved through the crew like wind through grass. Vale stiffened. "I discipline my actors when necessary. That's called directing. That's called hitting a child." The room tightened. Dean stepped forward, but not aggressively. Just close enough that Vale had to lower his hand fully. The boy's eyes darted between the two men, confusion overtaking fear. "You don't understand," Vale continued, voice steady but strained. "Some kids respond to firmness. He keeps missing his mark." Dean glanced down at the boy. "Kid," he said gently, kneeling to eye level. "Oh, what's your name?" "Daniel," the boy whispered. "Daniel," Dean said softly. "Did you mean to mess up?" Daniel shook his head violently. "No, sir." Dean smiled slightly. "Nobody ever means to mess up. That's why it's called a mistake." He removed a folded handkerchief from his pocket and gently pressed it to Daniel's cheek. Vale's composure began to crack. "You're interfering with my production," he said sharply. "You have no authority here." Dean stood slowly. "I don't need authority to know when something's wrong." Silence blanketed the set. Crew members who had stood motionless now shifted subtly. A lighting technician stepped closer. A script supervisor lowered her clipboard. Fear has structure. Once one person steps outside it, the structure weakens. Vale attempted to regain control. This is how films are made. Pressure, intensity. You wouldn't understand. You sing. I create art. Dean's expression remained unreadable. Art doesn't require fear. Vale scoffed. You think you're a hero? No, Dean replied evenly. I think I'm a father. That landed differently. Dean looked around the room slowly, making eye contact with the crew. You all saw it, he said quietly, and you all know it shouldn't have happened. Nobody spoke, but nobody denied it. Dean turned back to Vale. If he misses a mark again, you move the mark. You don't move your hand. Vale's jaw tightened. You're jeopardizing your reputation, he warned. Studios protect directors who deliver results. Dean shrugged faintly. Studios protect money. They protect headlines. They don't protect men who embarrass them. The air shifted. Vale realized, perhaps too late, that the narrative had already turned. Dean knelt once more beside Daniel. Go sit with wardrobe, he said gently. Get some water. Take your time. Daniel nodded, still trembling but no longer alone. As he walked away, several crew members instinctively moved with him. The structure had cracked. Vale exhaled slowly, fury simmering beneath forced calm. This will cost you, he said quietly. Dean tilted his head slightly. Maybe. He paused. But it'll cost you more. He didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked out of the soundstage the same way he had entered, steady, unhurried. Behind him, something had changed, not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur Vale was not the most powerful man in the room. At the breakfast that shifted Hollywood. The morning after the incident on Stage 12 did not begin with headlines, shouting, or confrontation. It began quietly, as most consequential shifts in power do. Dean Martin arrived at the Beverly Hills Hotel just before 8, dressed as he always was for breakfast meetings. Tailored but effortless, tie slightly loosened, expression relaxed enough to disarm anyone who underestimated him. The patio was calm, insulated from the noise of the studio lots and the undercurrents that moved through them. Producers and agents liked this place because conversations felt smaller there, more contained, as if decisions made over coffee would not echo beyond the hedges. But they always did. Waiting at the table was studio executive Leonard Cartwright, a man whose authority did not rely on loudness, but on ledger books. Cartwright had been in the business long enough to understand that Hollywood was not sustained by talent alone. It was sustained by silence, by convenience, and by the unspoken agreement that certain behaviors were tolerated if they produced profit. He greeted Dean warmly, though he sensed this was not a social visit. They ordered coffee. For a few minutes they spoke of box office numbers, of distribution rights overseas, of the usual machinery that kept the industry humming. Then Dean set his cup down with deliberate care. His voice remained measured, but something in his posture shifted. I walked onto another set yesterday, he began calmly. I heard something I shouldn't have heard. Cartwright did not interrupt, and he had learned that men who rarely complained did not do so casually. Dean described what he had seen without embellishment. He did not dramatize. He did not speculate. He simply recounted the moment, the sound, the boy, the raised hand. He described the crew's silence, the normalization of fear. He did not accuse beyond what he witnessed, but he made one thing clear. It could not happen again. Cartwright listened, expression tightening almost imperceptibly. The name Arthur Vale carried weight in studio corridors. Vale's films had delivered awards and prestige. He was temperamental, yes, but that volatility had long been reframed as genius. In Hollywood, genius excused much, but what Dean had described was not volatility, it was violence. Are you certain? Cartwright asked carefully. Dean met his gaze steadily. I'm certain enough. There was a pause that stretched between business calculation and moral obligation. Cartwright understood something fundamental in that moment. This was not about scandal yet. It was about control. If a star of Dean's stature spoke publicly, the studio would lose narrative authority. If the studio acted first, they could shape the outcome. "What do you want?" Cartwright asked. Dean leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "I want it handled. Quietly if possible. Thoroughly. Definitely." Cartwright considered the implications. An internal review would require testimony. Crew members would need to speak. Some would hesitate. Others perhaps had been waiting for an opening. "Vale has contracts," Cartwright said. "Projects in development." "So did a lot of men before they didn't," Dean replied evenly. And the conversation did not escalate. It did not need to. The gravity of it settled naturally. Cartwright recognized that protecting Vale might protect short-term profits, but it risked long-term reputation. The industry was built on image. If word spread that the studio ignored harm to a child actor, the damage would extend far beyond one director. An internal investigation began within days, not loudly, not publicly. Production accountants were instructed to audit behavioral complaints tied to Vale's sets. Human Resources reviewed archived incident reports that had previously been dismissed as exaggerations. Assistant directors were called in individually and asked careful questions. The language was measured: professional conduct, workplace environment, actor welfare. But beneath those phrases lay a deeper inquiry. What emerged was not a singular incident, but a pattern. Harsh discipline disguised as artistic intensity. Children pressured beyond emotional capacity. Crew members intimidated into silence. Parents subtly warned that difficult reputations could follow their children if they spoke up. Once one technician spoke honestly, others followed. Fear began to fracture. Vale sensed the shift before he was officially informed. Meetings were postponed. Calls went unanswered. His access to executive offices tightened. Rumors circulated that an external consultant was reviewing his past productions. He attempted to leverage his prestige, reminding associates of awards, of financial success. But prestige weakens quickly when liability enters the conversation. 2 weeks later, Vale was summoned to Cartwright's office. The conversation was brief, clinical. A clause in his contract referencing conduct detrimental to the studio's interests was invoked. Future projects were reassigned for creative realignment. His representation was advised to pursue opportunities elsewhere. There was no dramatic firing scene, no shouting, just paperwork and severance. Vale left the lot that afternoon through the same gate he had entered for over a decade. Few noticed. Those who did not stop him. On stage 12, something subtle but powerful shifted. The set felt lighter. Not joyful, film sets rarely are, but steadier. Crew members who had once avoided eye contact with child actors now engaged more openly. Assistant directors adopted clearer rehearsal protocols. Parents were given structured observation access. A welfare liaison was quietly added to productions involving minors. And Dean did not tour the lot expecting thanks. He did not give interviews. He continued filming his own project without referencing the incident publicly. But word traveled internally. Actors knew, technicians knew, and most importantly, families knew. Daniel, the boy at the center of it all, returned to the studio weeks later under a new director. He moved cautiously at first, flinching at raised voices even when they were unrelated. But this time, when he missed a mark, the director smiled and reset the scene without commentary. It was not extraordinary kindness. It was simply professionalism. For Daniel, that difference was enormous. Dean visited the set once, not intrusively, just long enough to greet Daniel. He crouched again, meeting him at eye level. "How's the window crossing?" he asked lightly. Daniel smiled shyly. "I hit it on father every time now." Dean chuckled softly. "Good. But even if you didn't, that's okay too." The boy nodded, absorbing something larger than technique. Hollywood did not transform overnight. It rarely does. But within studio meetings, new language entered contracts regarding child actor supervision. Insurance policies were updated. Producers began discussing on-set accountability in ways they had not before. The incident was never officially cited, yet its influence threaded quietly through policy. Cartwright later admitted privately to a colleague that the decision had been simpler than expected. "When someone like Martin draws a line," he had said, "you either respect it or risk everything." Dean never framed it as heroism. He did not recount it in later interviews. When asked about challenges in Hollywood, and he deflected with humor, as he often did. But those who had been present understood the deeper truth. Authority had been challenged not through spectacle, but through calm refusal to tolerate harm. Fear depends on isolation. Once that isolation dissolves, its power fades. In the months that followed, Daniel's performance improved noticeably. Not because of pressure, but because of safety. Children learn better when they are not bracing for impact. He began to rediscover joy in acting, a curiosity about scenes rather than anxiety about mistakes. His parents remained vigilant, but they no longer felt alone navigating the industry. Dean continued mentoring him quietly, offering occasional guidance, introducing him to directors known for patience rather than intimidation. He never positioned himself as protector publicly, but privately he remained watchful. Years later, Daniel would reflect that the most significant moment of his childhood was not a premiere or a role. It was the moment someone said, "That's enough," and meant it. On that March afternoon, Dean Martin had not ended a career with rage or theatrics. He had shifted a system by refusing to accept what others tolerated. He had leveraged reputation not for dominance, but for defense, and in doing so, he altered the trajectory of more than one life. Breakfast had seemed ordinary. Coffee had tasted the same. But by the time the plates were cleared, something in Hollywood had quietly recalibrated. Power had met conscience, and conscience had held. The boy who refused to break time did not erase what happened on stage 12. It softened the edges, perhaps, but it did not remove the imprint. Trauma rarely disappears simply because justice is served. It lingers in subtle reflexes, in flinches, in hesitations, in the quiet doubt that asks, "Was it really my fault?" For Daniel, the weeks after the incident were complicated. The studio had acted. The director was gone. The adults around him had begun speaking about safety and policies and new standards. But Daniel was 8 years old. He did not understand contracts or investigations. He understood only that someone bigger had hurt him, and someone bigger had stopped it. The second truth began to matter more. When he returned to the set under new leadership, everything felt different and yet strangely fragile. He expected anger in raised voices. He braced himself when someone called, "Cut." Even praise felt suspicious at first, as if it might reverse without warning. But the new director, a calm, understated man named Harold Keene, operated differently. Keene explained blocking in simple terms. He rehearsed without shouting. He corrected mistakes by demonstrating rather than accusing. The crew, aware of what had happened before, became subtly protective. If Daniel stumbled over a line, a grip might offer a quiet thumbs up. A costume assistant would joke gently to reset the mood. It was not overcompensation. It was collective awareness. Dean checked in periodically, never announcing himself as a guardian. He would visit under the pretense of casual drop-ins, speaking to Daniel about baseball scores or favorite films rather than revisiting the past. What Dean understood instinctively was that protection did not require constant reminder of harm. It required restoration of normalcy. But he made sure Daniel felt like a kid who happened to act, not an actor defined by an incident. One afternoon, months after the confrontation, Daniel missed a mark again. It was a simple cross to the window, the same action that had once triggered rage. The camera crew paused. Keene reset the scene calmly. Daniel froze, breath catching involuntarily. The moment hovered. Dean, who had been observing quietly from the side, watched closely but did not intervene. Keene crouched to Daniel's level and said gently, "Let's try it one more time. No rush." There was no edge in his voice, no impatience. Daniel nodded and did it again. He hit the mark. The set moved on. But something else happened internally. The association between mistake and punishment weakened. A new association formed, mistake and correction. And that subtle neurological shift marked the beginning of Daniel's real resilience. He was not fearless. He was rebuilding. As the months passed, Daniel's performance matured noticeably. He began to bring nuance into scenes, small emotional gestures that critics later praised as natural authenticity. What they did not see was the foundation beneath it, safety. Children perform best when they are not performing for survival. They create when they are not defending. Dean's mentorship extended beyond occasional visits. He invited Daniel and his parents to small gatherings at his home, not glamorous Hollywood parties, but relaxed afternoons by the pool where the industry's noise felt distant. There, Daniel saw adults laugh without tension. He saw actors speak casually about missed lines and bad auditions. He witnessed imperfection treated as normal. For a child who had internalized the idea that error invited violence, that exposure was healing. Daniel's parents, once ready to withdraw him entirely from acting, began to reconsider. They established firmer boundaries in contracts. They insisted on presence during rehearsals. They learned to ask questions they once felt intimidated to raise. What had happened on Stage 12 did not only change a director's fate, it educated a family on the importance of vigilance. Empowerment replaced passive trust. Meanwhile, quiet industry reforms continued. Child welfare supervisors became more common. Informal reporting mechanisms strengthened. Not every set transformed overnight, but awareness had entered the bloodstream of production culture. So whispers about behavior were no longer automatically dismissed as exaggerations. One confrontation had cracked the myth that volatility equaled brilliance. Daniel grew older within that evolving environment. Adolescence brought its own challenges. Insecurity, comparison, the shifting identity of a child actor navigating maturity. There were moments he considered quitting, moments when he wondered if the incident would always shadow him. But each time doubt surfaced, another memory rose alongside it. A man kneeling, a handkerchief pressed gently to his cheek, a calm voice saying, "You didn't do anything wrong." That sentence became an internal anchor. By his late teens, Daniel transitioned from child roles to more complex characters. He did not become an overnight star, nor did he desire to. And what he sought was sustainability, the ability to work without losing himself. Directors described him as grounded. Crew members noted his unusual attentiveness to younger actors. On sets where child performers were present, Daniel often found himself quietly observing interactions, ensuring tone remained professional. If tension rose unnecessarily, he would intervene casually, redirecting energy with humor or offering encouragement before anxiety could root. He never referenced his own past publicly. He did not frame himself as an advocate. He simply acted differently because someone had once acted for him. Years later, in an interview about the early days of his career, Daniel was asked what kept him in the industry when so many child actors burned out or withdrew. He paused thoughtfully before answering. "And I learned early," he said carefully, "that not everyone in power uses it the same way. I was lucky to see both sides." The interviewer pressed for clarification, but Daniel declined to elaborate. Some stories remain private not out of secrecy, but out of respect. The lesson was more important than the headline. Dean continued his own career trajectory, maintaining his public image of ease and charm. Those who knew him understood there was depth beneath the cool. He did not speak often about integrity. He demonstrated it. When colleagues later praised him for professionalism, they rarely understood the layers behind that word. Professionalism to Dean meant more than hitting marks and arriving on time. It meant ensuring the environment itself allowed others to thrive. Daniel carried that model forward unconsciously. On a set in the late 1970s, when a young actress struggled through a difficult emotional scene, Daniel requested a brief pause. He walked her through the blocking calmly, reminding her she could reset as many times as needed. The director, noticing the exchange, nodded approvingly. No raised voices followed. The scene succeeded. Patterns replicate. So do corrections. By adulthood, Daniel's career settled into steady character work, supporting roles that anchored larger productions. He valued consistency over spotlight. Those who worked with him frequently commented on the calm he brought to sets. He understood instinctively how fear alters performance. He also understood how quickly calm restores it. The boy who once trembled under fluorescent lights did not break. He recalibrated. And in that recalibration lay the true impact of what had happened years earlier. It was not simply about ending one director's dominance. It was about interrupting a cycle before it solidified into generational repetition. Violence in creative spaces often masquerades as passion. Daniel's adulthood stood as quiet proof that art does not require intimidation. In private moments, he occasionally revisited the memory of that afternoon, not to relive pain, but to measure growth. The red imprint on his cheek had faded long ago. What remained was the imprint of protection, a template for how authority could function differently. He did not become defined by victimhood. He became defined by continuity. And somewhere, perhaps unknowingly, Dean would have understood that the most powerful legacy is not confrontation itself, but what grows from it. The man who said, "Enough time rarely announces the moments that will define it. It disguises them as interruptions, as inconveniences, as minor deviations from routine." The afternoon Dean walked onto stage 12 had felt, at first, like nothing more than a disturbance between takes. But years later, when careers had evolved and reputations had shifted, that brief interruption revealed itself as something far more enduring. It had not only altered one director's trajectory or one boy's sense of safety, it had quietly rewritten a standard. Dean never spoke publicly about what happened that day. In interviews throughout the decades that followed, he remained the image the world expected, relaxed, amused, rarely serious for long. He deflected personal questions with charm. He told stories about music, about touring, and about the camaraderie of show business. If journalists pressed for commentary on industry reform or child actor protections, he redirected the focus toward professionalism in general terms. He understood something subtle about influence. The most lasting impact does not require narration. But within studio corridors, the memory endured. Crew members who had been present that afternoon retold the story not as scandal, but as instruction. It became part of informal training for assistant directors and stage managers. "You don't let it escalate," they would say quietly. "You stop it early." That phrase carried weight because it had once been demonstrated without theatrics. There had been no shouting, no physical escalation, no spectacle, only a line drawn calmly and held. Daniel grew into Thomas Mitchell Marsh, a working actor known less for celebrity than for steadiness. He built a career defined by reliability rather than volatility. Directors trusted him. Producers valued him. He did not dominate scenes. He supported them. That instinct came from somewhere deeper than technique. It came from understanding the fragility of creative environments. He knew how quickly fear can suffocate authenticity. As Thomas matured, he began mentoring younger performers quietly, especially children entering the industry. He would pull them aside during breaks and explain marks, camera angles, the rhythm of rehearsal. He spoke gently about mistakes, reframing them as adjustments rather than failures. Parents noticed the difference immediately. They sensed that he was not simply guiding performance, he was guarding confidence. One evening, decades after stage 12, Thomas found himself seated beside Dean at a small charity event benefiting arts education. The years had softened Dean's features slightly, but not his presence. They spoke casually at first, about scripts and scheduling conflicts. Eventually, Thomas leaned closer and said, almost casually, "You know that day changed everything for me." Dean did not ask which day. He knew. "You changed it yourself," Dean replied evenly. "All I did was show up." Thomas shook his head gently. "Most people don't." Dean studied him for a moment, not with pride, but with something closer to relief. He understood then that the confrontation had not been about punishment. It had been about interruption, the interruption of a belief that power excused harm, and the interruption of a pattern that could have hardened inside a child's developing mind, the interruption of silence. As the industry moved into later decades, conversations around workplace safety evolved. Contracts grew more explicit. Reporting channels became more formalized. While no single event could claim responsibility for those changes, stories like the one on stage 12 lingered beneath the surface. They reminded those in power that their authority could be questioned, not by chaos, but by composure. When Dean passed away in the mid-1990s, tributes focused on music, on humor, on the persona that had defined a generation. Few mentioned quiet confrontations. Few knew their details. But at the private service, attended by close friends and colleagues, Thomas stood near the back of the room, so watching family members share stories of warmth and generosity. He felt no need to speak publicly. The moment did not belong to him. Yet as he listened, he recognized that the version of Dean he had known, steady, unafraid to draw boundaries, aligned perfectly with the man being remembered. After the service, a young actor approached Thomas hesitantly. The boy was perhaps 9, cast recently in a television pilot. He had heard whispers of an old Hollywood story involving Thomas and Dean. He did not know specifics. He only knew it involved protection. "Is it true," the boy asked quietly, "that someone stood up for you once?" Thomas looked at him carefully, seeing not just curiosity but vulnerability. He knelt, mirroring a gesture from decades earlier, and answered with deliberate calm. "Yes. And now I stand up for others." That exchange captured the essence of legacy more clearly than any headline could. Arthur Vail's name faded into obscurity over time. His earlier accolades became footnotes rather than defining markers. The industry remembered his films, perhaps, but not with reverence. What lingered instead was the lesson his downfall represented. Authority built on fear collapses quickly when challenged. Dean's legacy, conversely, endured not because of confrontation, but because of consistency. He had not pursued vengeance. He had not staged a public spectacle. He had intervened once and then continued living with the same composure that characterized his career. That continuity mattered. It prevented the incident from becoming mythology and allowed it to remain human. Thomas carried that model forward into advocacy work later in life. He contributed quietly to initiatives strengthening oversight for child performers. He participated in policy discussions without referencing personal trauma. When asked what motivated his involvement, he would respond simply, "No child should think it's their fault." Those words echoed the sentence once spoken to him. Looking back, Thomas understood that the power of that moment on stage 12 did not lie in intimidation or threats. It lay in visibility. Someone had seen him, not as a liability, not as a prop, not as a child who had failed, but as a person deserving of dignity. That recognition altered the course of his development more profoundly than any award or opportunity ever could. In later interviews reflecting on the industry's evolution, Thomas described creative spaces as ecosystems. They either nourish, he would say, or they corrode. There isn't much middle ground. The difference often hinged on whether someone was willing to say enough when it mattered. The phrase itself carried weight beyond its syllables. It signaled a boundary. It asserted that talent does not justify cruelty. It reminded observers that silence is a choice, and so is intervention. As the decades turned and new generations entered Hollywood with fresh ambitions, the story of Stage 12 circulated quietly among insiders. It was never printed in tabloids. It never trended publicly. But it existed where it mattered most, in behavior. Assistant directors who had heard it became more attentive. Producers who understood its implications inserted stronger protections into contracts. And actors who admired Dean's composure internalized his example. Legacy, after all, is rarely built on spectacle. It is built on repetition. Dean Martin's songs continued to play on radios and streaming services. His image remained synonymous with effortless cool. But beneath the polished surface lay something steadier, a willingness to interrupt harm, even when it risked inconvenience. That willingness defined him more deeply than applause ever could. Thomas once summarized it best during a panel discussion years later. "People talk about cool," he said thoughtfully. "Cool isn't indifference. It isn't detachment. It's control. It's knowing exactly when to step in and when to step back. And the coolest man I ever knew stepped in." The audience applauded politely, unaware of the full history embedded in that statement. And Thomas did not elaborate. He did not need to. The lesson had already been absorbed by those who mattered. And so the story closed not with dramatic revenge, nor with public humiliation, but with continuity. A child who once trembled grew into a man who steadied others. A moment of harm was interrupted before it calcified into identity. A single calm voice reshaped a room, and in doing so, reshaped more than one life. Sometimes change does not roar. Sometimes it says two words softly. That's enough. And when those words are spoken at the right time by the right person, they echo far longer than anyone expects.